On June 14, 2024, at 4:12 a.m., a long-haul truck driver named Darius Kim saw a barefoot woman walking against traffic on the shoulder of Highway 90, about 40 miles from the town of Branch Creek in the state of Arizona. A barefoot woman walking against traffic. She was wearing a t-shirt that would later be identified as the very one she had been wearing when she went missing 12 years ago. When the police check her fingerprints and tooth enamel patterns, they'll discover something that no forensic pathologist in the county can explain. Standing before them was Madison Tate, who had gone missing at age 16 and had been listed in the federal database as just another statistic among tens of thousands of unsolved cases. Formally, she was 28. The doctors who conducted the initial examination would note in her chart a phrase that would later become the subject of an internal investigation. Based on a combination of indicators of bone density and dental development, the patient's physiological age corresponds to that of a 19 to 20-year-old. Madison Jane Tate was born on March 3, 1996, into a family that neighbors described as ordinary, so often that the word became part of her file long before she disappeared. His father, Wayne Tate, worked as a long-haul truck driver on the Phoenix-El Paso route and came home once every week and a half to 2 weeks. Her mother, Carol Tate, worked as a bookkeeper at a local agricultural supply store and raised her on her own after their divorce in 2010. Madison had a younger sister, Haley, who was 4 years younger, and a part-time job as a waitress at the Cactus Diner on the weekends. She played softball for the Branch Creek High School team at second base, drove a used blue Ford Escort which she'd inherited from her aunt, and was the kind of teenager whose teachers all tell investigators the same thing. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a normal girl. Stubborn, perhaps. In 2012, Branch Creek had a population of just over 1,800, a gas station, a grocery store, a high school with a little over 300 students, a Baptist church, and that very same Cactus Diner where Madison served coffee on weekends for $9 an hour plus tips. The town thrived at the intersection of cattle ranching and long-haul transit. Trucks rolled through it day and night on Highway 90, and the evenings were so quiet they rang in your ears. Neighbors could hear dogs barking from 1.5 kilometers away. Madison was friends with 2 girls from the softball team, Jenna Ortiz and Kylie Voss, her boyfriend's cousin. And, according to both of them, nothing in her behavior over the past few weeks had revealed any fear or secrets. No new acquaintances, no arguments, no debts. Nothing that usually comes to light in such cases during the very first serious interrogation. Her biology teacher, Mr. Ferris, remembered her as a student who argued about everything but always made a valid point. A detail that would later strike investigators as almost ironic, given how many years would be spent debating what actually happened to her. During the very first week, investigators requested call records from the telecommunications provider and a history of her activity on her Facebook account. At that time, it was essentially the only platform used by the Branch Creek teenagers, and found nothing that would indicate preparations for a runaway. No deleted messages, no new contacts, and no search queries related to bus routes or rental housing. Her last activity on the app was recorded at 5:40 p.m. that same day. She liked a photo that Jenna Ortiz posted from their workout together. After that, nothing. Not a single visit, which for a 16-year-old girl of her generation was, in itself, almost as telling a fact as the absence of a body. Friday, June 22, 2012 began just like hundreds of other summer Fridays in the Sander Creek area. By noon, the temperature had risen above 38 degrees. The sky was cloudless, that flat, faded blue that never changes for weeks on end in these parts. Madison worked her shift at the Cactus from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., went home, had dinner with her mother and sister, and around 7:30 in the evening, she hopped on her bike to ride to her boyfriend Tyler Voss's house, a full 3.2 kilometers down County Road 181, a narrow paved road between alfalfa fields lined with mesquite bushes along the shoulders. That evening, the mother saw her daughter for the last time at that very moment. The girl was wrapping the strap of the softball bag, which she had brought along so she could stop by practice afterward, around the steering wheel. Carol Tate hadn't seen her daughter alive for 12 years. The road from the Tatov's house to the Vossov's house runs through an area that the locals call the Lowlands. There, County Road 181 curves gently between 2 low hills, and for about 400 meters, not a single house is visible on either side. The sun set at 8:51 that evening, and according to Tyler Voss, Madison was supposed to show up at his place around 8:15. She didn't show up. He called her cell phone at 8:37. The call went to voicemail. He called again at 9 o'clock. Same thing. At 9:30, he got on his bike and rode down County Road 181 toward her, hoping to find her with a flat tire somewhere on the side of the road. Tyler didn't decide right away to call Carol Tate. He called Jenna and Kylie first, figuring that Madison might have stopped by one of her friends' houses and lost track of time. Neither of them had seen her since lunch. By 9:15, when twilight had already deepened so much that his bicycle headlight could barely pierce the darkness between the mosquito bushes, he decided to call her mother. And it was during that very call, which, according to his later account, lasted less than a minute, that Carol's voice faltered so noticeably that he realized something was wrong even before he saw the bicycle himself. It was a windless evening. The stars were already beginning to appear in the east, and from the west came the occasional rumble of semi-trucks on Highway 90. A sound so familiar that no one notices it until the silence that follows begins to seem suspicious. What he found explained nothing and, at the same time, ruled out almost everything. Madison's bicycle lay in a shallow ditch 6 meters from the asphalt, neatly positioned as if it had been placed there rather than thrown there during the fall. The front wheel was turned exactly 90 degrees, the chain hadn't come off, and the brake cables were undamaged. 15 meters further down the roadside, in the short grass, lay one of her sneakers. The right one, with the laces tied, as if her foot had been pulled out of it rather than having slipped off while she was running. The bag itself, containing the softball mold, remained strapped to the bike's rear rack, zipped shut, with its contents untouched. Madison's phone was never found. Not then, not later, and not even during a second search of the area with metal detectors 2 years later. Deputy Sheriff Curtis Dale was the first to arrive on the scene, who was on duty that shift in the northern part of the county. He arrived at 10:40 p.m., 12 minutes after Tyler called the dispatch center, and it was his report that formed the basis of the case. Dale described the stretch of road as deserted in both directions, not a single car the whole time I was there, which in itself was unusual for a Friday evening, when farmers returning from work often drive through the valley. By midnight, 3 patrol units were already on the scene, along with Sheriff Richard Salazar himself, who had been roused from bed by a personal call from the dispatcher. A full-scale search operation involving volunteers from neighboring counties, a helicopter from the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and K-9 teams began at dawn the following day, June 23rd, and continued non-stop for 8 days, and then, with breaks, for another 3 weeks. But the strangest detail, the one that 12 years later would resurface in her own story as a starting point, had nothing to do with objects, but with the ground. Off to the side of the road, about 22 meters from where the bicycle was lying, the sheriff's search party discovered an almost perfect circle with a diameter of about 7 meters, within the boundaries of which the tall summer grass was not flattened, but rather flattened, pressed evenly to the ground, without a single blade of grass sticking up, as if a heavy roller had passed over that area. The search and rescue team, called in on the 3rd day, lost Madison's trail right at the edge of this circle. Both dogs, which had been working independently of each other with a 40-minute interval between them, stopped simultaneously at the same invisible line and refused to go any further, whimpering and backing away. The handler of one of the dogs, Frank Ortega, gave testimony that was recorded verbatim in the minutes. The dog was tracking confidently the whole way, but here it was as if it had run into a wall. There was no wall. On the same day, 11 people were interviewed within a radius of 1.5 kilometers of the discovery site. Neighbors, passing motorists, and workers at the nearby Whitcomb farm, whose land bordered County Road 181 on the east side. 2 of the farm workers, brothers Danny and Curtis Whitcomb, reported independently of one another that between about 8 o'clock and 8:30 p.m., they heard a short, steady hum coming from the direction of the low-lying area. Not an engine, not a generator, something lower in pitch, like a refrigerator, only louder, as Danny Whitcomb put it, which, by his estimate, lasted no more than a minute and stopped abruptly, without fading away. Neither of the brothers thought much of it until he found out about the disappearance the next day. Both men's statements were recorded in the report, but investigators ultimately attributed the noise to an irrigation pump operating in a neighboring field, even though the farm owner later confirmed that the pump had not been turned on that evening. Carol Tate filed a missing person report at 9:48 p.m. that same day, and this is where the part of the story begins that is usually glossed over in most investigations of this kind, because it's not about kidnappers or aliens, but about the structure of the system that was supposed to search for Madison Tate and failed to do so effectively even during those critical first hours. The case was registered with the National Crime Information Center, an FBI database known as the NCIC, under an internal reference number that was never officially disclosed to the family, because, contrary to what is shown in movies, the NCIC is not accessible to the general public at all. It is a closed system accessible only to law enforcement officials, and the missing person's family cannot log in and check the status of the case on their own, no matter how desperately they might want to. There is another database, NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Database, which is maintained by the U.S. Department of Justice and was specifically created as a public tool. Relatives can upload photos, physical descriptions, dental records, and DNA samples themselves. Carol Tate learned about NAMUS not from the police, but from a volunteer organization nearly 2 months after her daughter's disappearance, by which time Sheriff Richard Salazar had effectively reclassified the case as active search with no new leads. The problem that this case, and tens of thousands of similar cases, will bring to light is that the NCIC and NAMUS are not technically linked directly to one another. These are two separate systems with different data entry protocols, and information entered into one database does not automatically appear in the other. The family could have created a full-fledged NAMUS profile with photos of Madison from various angles, while the county police would have continued to maintain their own case in the NCIC, and these two databases would exist in parallel without physically seeing each other. The process of creating a NAMUS profile, which Carol Tate went through in the fall of 2012, required her to gather a set of documents that, in theory, the police should have provided but in practice fell on the family's shoulders: a dental record, which she had to request in person from Madison's pediatric dentist, a reference DNA sample, for which she and Haley provided swabs, since there was, of course, no direct sample from Madison herself, a series of photographs taken from different angles and under different lighting conditions, which the system requires for facial recognition algorithms. None of these documents are automatically submitted to the NCIC. Carol completed each step separately by hand, filling out forms that, in her own words, are written in a language as if they were drafted for lawyers, not for mothers. The magnitude of this gap is not abstract. According to data for fiscal year 2015, approximately 3,170 long-term missing persons cases were officially registered in the NAMUS system. At the same time, there were 84,401 long-term cases on file with the NCIC. This does not mean that 81,000 people are being deliberately hidden from the public as part of some conspiracy. It means that the overwhelming majority of long-term cases simply never make it into the database accessible to families, journalists, and volunteers, because entering data into the public system is not mandatory for investigative agencies and depends, in essence, on the good faith of a particular detective in a particular county. Patty Jensen, the head of Project Phoenix, a small volunteer organization that helped the Tate family raise public awareness of their case, put it simply: people think there's one big database where every missing person is listed, and that someone is actually checking it. In fact, there are several databases. They don't communicate with each other, and whether a case ends up in one of them depends on how busy a particular detective is that week. It is also important to understand why the FBI did not get involved in the Tate case at an early stage, even though the agency manages the NCIC database itself. Federal jurisdiction in cases involving missing adults and adolescents that are not directly related to interstate abductions is by no means automatic. The Bureau has the authority to become involved in an investigation, but it usually does so either upon a direct request from local authorities or when specific evidence emerges indicating an interstate crime. In the Tate case, no such trigger occurred, no ransom, no phone calls, no car spotted at the state line. And so for 12 years, the case remained exclusively under the jurisdiction of the Sand Creek County Sheriff, whose investigative budget at the time amounted to, according to the county report, just over $700,000 a year for the entire spectrum of crimes, not just missing persons cases. In practice, this meant that Detective McPhee would periodically log into Madison's public NAMUS profile manually, cross-referencing it with internal case notes in the NCIC, a procedure that no one had instructed her to follow, but which she carried out, in her own words, because otherwise one eye of the system wouldn't know what the other was seeing. Such manual cross-checking is not part of the standard protocol for either agency and depends entirely on the personal integrity of the individual officer. Whenever the detective in charge of the case changes, and over the course of 12 years, the Tate case was transferred 3 times from one officer to another due to personnel changes in the sheriff's department. Such informal coordination is often simply interrupted when the person who maintained it leaves. There is another side to the problem, one that is far more mundane, yet no less alarming: the quality of the data within the system itself. Since the NCIC was launched, agencies have struggled for years with poor data entry practices. For example, nationwide, dental records are attached to only about 1,900 missing persons cases out of every 100,000, or less than 2% of cases. This means that even if a person is found, whether alive, dead, or in a condition requiring identification by dental records, there may be nothing physically available to link the discovery to a specific open case. Not a conspiracy, but bureaucratic negligence. A map that no one scanned or attached to the file because there wasn't enough time, resources, or a direct order from above to do so. A similar, separately documented issue concerns missing members of the indigenous peoples of the United States. The Government Accountability Office explicitly states in its reports that national databases objectively do not contain complete data on all missing Native Americans and Alaska Natives due to unclear protocols for cooperation, jurisdictional conflicts between tribal and federal agencies, and families' basic lack of awareness about where to even file a report. Patty Jensen, who has seen dozens of similar cases over the years working with Project Phoenix, noted, "The system isn't designed to hide people. It's just not designed well enough to find them." On paper, the difference is small. For a family, it's huge. It was precisely against the backdrop of this silent gap, one that no one had deliberately created, but which was no less effective for that, between the two databases that the Madison Tate case unfolded over the following years. Sheriff Salazar and Detective Lauren McPhee, who had been assigned to him, went through the standard set of possibilities. First, a runaway. The girl had a fight with her mother, went to stay with friends, and would turn up in a week. A week has passed, and the rumor has not been confirmed. Next was Tyler Voss, the guy who was the last to admit that he had been waiting for her that evening. He had no alibi for the period between 7:45 and 9 p.m., other than his own mother's testimony. And for 3 weeks, he remained the prime suspect until he passed a polygraph test, and the phone company confirmed that his cell phone had remained connected to a cell tower in the opposite direction from 181 County Road all evening. Next, they looked into the father, Wayne Tate, who was having financial problems and who, according to the trucking company's GPS data, was more than 900 kilometers away in New Mexico at the time of his daughter's disappearance. That theory was ruled out just as quickly as it had been proposed. We checked the registry of individuals convicted of sex crimes within a 60-kilometer radius. 12 people, all with confirmed alibis. We checked the wells, the abandoned mines, and the dried-up riverbeds south of the city. Nothing. In addition to the main leads, the Sheriff's Department followed up on 47 separate tips received via the hotline during the first 3 months, ranging from, "I saw a girl who looked like her at the bus station in Tucson," to an anonymous call claiming that Madison had fallen victim to a cult operating in the Chiricahua Mountains. It took 6 weeks to investigate this lead, and it turned up nothing but an abandoned camp with no signs of human presence in recent years. They also investigated the possibility that Madison might have drowned in Parker Canyon Reservoir, more than 20 kilometers to the south. Divers from the Department of Public Safety searched the bottom with a trawl net for 4 days, but found nothing. By the end of the summer of 2012, the case remained open, but, as Sheriff Salazar himself admitted to the Arizona Daily Star a year later, "We tried everything the protocol calls for, and the protocol ran out before we ran out of questions." The family reacted as all families do in such circumstances. Flyers posted on every utility pole from Branch Creek to Wilcox, a billboard at the entrance to I-10 at the 302-mile marker, paid for out of Carol Tate's personal savings and donations collected through the church community, and a $25,000 reward for information announced by the family 2 months after her disappearance. Local news kept the story on the air for 3 weeks in a row, then aired 1 report per quarter and then 1 per year on the anniversary. As is often the case, the community was divided between those who believed that Madison had run away and would eventually come forward on her own, and those who were convinced that a crime had been committed, but that her body simply hadn't been found yet. There was also a third group which was considered marginal at the time. A few people, including the Teets' elderly neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Price, who insisted that on the night of the disappearance she had seen a silent light in the sky above the valley, too bright and too quiet to be a helicopter. Mrs. Price's testimony in the year 2012 was recorded in the minutes, but no one took it seriously. In the spring of 2014, nearly 2 years later, the family went through what Carol Tate would later call the worst week since her disappearance. The remains of an unidentified young woman, discovered by tourists in Pima County, were preliminarily matched to Madison's description based on age and build, and the family had to wait 10 days for the results of the DNA comparison. The result came back negative. The deceased was later identified as a victim in a separate, unrelated case. But that week, according to Haley, aged mom 10 years in 10 days. It was precisely after this incident that Carol Tate began insisting on keeping her own records of all her daughter's information, including her dental chart, which she personally took to the clinic to have scanned and sent to NamUs, because, as she put it, no one at the police department could guarantee to me that this record was even stored electronically anywhere. By 2015, the case had formally been reclassified as a long-term cold case, and by 2017, active investigation had effectively ceased, not out of malice, but because Sander Creek County, like most rural counties in Arizona, had a dozen open cases on its docket and a detective staff of just 4 people. Carol Tate continued to update the NamUs profile every year, adding aged composite sketches of what Madison might look like at 20 and then at 22. Haley, her younger sister, grew up, graduated from high school, moved to Tucson to attend college, and later told reporters that she had spent half her childhood in the shadow of a poster bearing her sister's face. Wayne Tate died of a heart attack in 2019, never having found out what had happened to his daughter. The billboard on I-10 stood there until 2021, when the billboard owner leased the space to a new company, and the family could no longer afford the rent. In 2016, the case briefly resurfaced when a woman who identified herself as Madison called the reception desk at the Phoenix District Attorney's office and, after a 40-minute conversation, admitted that it was a hoax. She was later sentenced to a fine and community service for knowingly making a false report. Carol Tate didn't find out about the call until after a local TV station had already aired a breaking news segment, and she recalled that episode as the moment after which she stopped watching live news coverage of her own case, preferring that Haley verify the information herself first. Every year, on June 22nd, several dozen people would gather outside the Branch Creek Baptist Church. Carol herself refused to call it a memorial service, insisting on the phrase, "an evening of hope," and a candle in her memory was lit on the porch of the Tate house at the same hour that Madison was last seen alive. By the 10th anniversary, in the year 2022, fewer than 20 people had come to the event, including Patty Jensen herself, who, in her own words, kept coming not because she believed in a new breakthrough, but because someone had to keep coming. According to Carol's own rough estimates, the costs of organizing the search and maintaining a public profile for the case amounted to more than $40,000 over 12 years. Billboards, printing flyers, and trips to meet with volunteer organizations across the state, none of which were ever reimbursed by any public fund, because such funds simply do not exist for families involved in long-term cases. And then, on June 14, 2024, truck driver Darius Kim pulled over to the side of Highway 90 because he initially thought that a man walking against traffic in the dark was about to be hit by an oncoming car. The next few hours are documented in greater detail than anything else in this case, because for the first time in 12 years, the focus was not on a search, but on a living person who needed to be examined, questioned, and somehow linked to a case that had long since been filed away in the archives. The woman refused to give her name and was in a state that the county hospital's doctor on duty, Dr. Helen Marsh, would later describe as severe disorientation regarding time, with no signs of alcohol or drug intoxication. When asked what year it was, she answered 12 twice before falling silent. The fingerprints matched a record in the database 40 minutes after they were sent for verification. Madison Jane Tate, date of birth March 3, 1996, NCIC status, missing person, case opened on June 22, 2012. Carol Tate arrived at the county hospital at 6:40 a.m., less than 3 hours after Darius Kim called 911. According to Rosita Alvarez, the nurse on duty who was present during the visit, the recognition wasn't immediate. Carol stood in the doorway of the room for a long time before saying her daughter's name out loud, and Madison herself, according to the nurse, looked at her as if she were trying to recall a face from a very old photograph. The first coherent words Madison spoke to her mother had nothing to do with the past 12 years, but rather with a bicycle chain. She asked if they had found the bike, and didn't understand why her mother was crying at that question. It was at this stage that a detail came to light that, 4 months later, would become the subject of a closed-door meeting at the district hospital attended by an independent dental consultant invited from Phoenix. Technically, Madison Tate should have been 28 years old. An X-ray of the wrist and collarbone, a standard procedure for determining bone age, showed results typical of a 19 to 20-year-old. The development of the wisdom teeth is at the same stage. According to the dermatologist's findings, the skin did not show the age-related changes expected for the past 12 years. In an interview she gave nearly a year later, after she had been dismissed from the county hospital, Dr. Marsh put it this way: "I can explain a missing person. I can't explain how a person who was away for 12 years could have aged 2 or 3 years physically. That's not how medicine works, and I don't know how to put that in an official report without ruining my own career." The meeting itself, which Dr. Marsh later described to reporters after her dismissal, took place in late October 2024 behind closed doors, without minutes that could later be requested through official channels. According to her, those present included Marsh herself, a guest dentist, a representative of the district attorney's office, and a man who was introduced to her only by his last name, Reynolds, without specifying which agency he represented. It was precisely after this meeting, Marsh claimed, that the wording in Madison's medical record became noticeably more vague, where her own initial notes had stated explicitly that bone age does not correspond to chronological age. The final version of the document, signed by a different doctor, included a much more neutral phrase referring to possible individual variations in skeletal development. Marsh refused to sign this version of the report, and shortly thereafter resigned from the county hospital of her own accord, a phrasing that, according to her, she did not choose. 2 symmetrical marks were found on Madison's body, one on her left wrist and one behind her right ear, each about 4 millimeters in diameter, round, slightly indented, with no signs of inflammation or healing typical of an accidental wound. The tissue around them looked as if the mark had been there for years, rather than having appeared recently. A pathologist, who had been called in for consultation, took a tissue sample from the scarred area and later informed the family off the record, since an official report on this point was never issued, that the mineral composition deep within the scar tissue contained trace inclusions that the laboratory was unable to classify using the standard alloy and mineral reference guides available in its database. The conclusion remained undetermined, and the sample itself, according to the family, was subsequently requested by a federal agency for further analysis and has not been returned. Information about what happened to this tissue sample became the subject of a separate, far less high-profile public scandal a year and a half later, when the Tate family, with the assistance of a lawyer, attempted to formally request the status of the analysis through a Freedom of Information Act request. The response, received 9 months after the request was submitted, contained a single sentence: "The case materials have been partially removed from public access due to an ongoing interagency investigation, the nature and duration of which cannot be disclosed." The family's attorney, Mark Espinoza, later stated publicly that in over 20 years of practice, he had never received a more evasive and, at the same time, more eloquent refusal. Usually, when an agency has nothing to hide, it at least cites the section of the law on which it is relying. They didn't mention anything here. Forensic experts specifically noted the length of Madison's hair and nails at the time of discovery. Based on standard methods used by anthropologists when working on cases involving prolonged isolation, their growth rate corresponded to approximately 2.5 to 3 years of continuous growth rather than 12. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Naomi Fletcher, brought in as a consultant by the University of Arizona, noted in her report that such a discrepancy either indicates regular haircuts under unknown conditions of confinement or a biological process for which there is simply no precedent in the professional literature. A statement she later, in her own words, regretted having ever uttered aloud in front of journalists. The little that Madison agreed to share, first with her mother, then, nearly 2 months after her return, in a single in-depth interview with a hospital psychologist, portions of which were leaked to the press through a source that was never identified, was presented not as a coherent narrative, but as a collection of fragments interwoven with her own distorted perception of the past. According to her, she remembers the evening of June 22nd down to the moment she pulled over to the side of County Road 181. The bicycle chain seemed loose to her, so she leaned over to check the tension. Further on in her description, there is a break. First, a silent flash of light, so intense that she could not determine its source, neither from above nor from the side. Then, the sensation that the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid, as if the air had become denser than water and was holding me up, preventing me from falling. The next thing she remembers clearly is that it was no longer a street or a field, but a room with a low ceiling, lit by an even, cold light with no visible sources, no shadows in the corners, and a floor that felt warm to the touch, almost like skin. She described the room where she first woke up as oblong, with a ceiling that, to her, felt just over 2 meters high, and walls that felt both hard and yielding to the touch. As if you were pressing against something solid, but it gives way slightly and springs back. According to her, there was no smell at all, not a single one. No metal, no chemicals, no human sweat, nothing one would expect from an enclosed space where, according to her subsequent estimates, there were at least several dozen people at any given time. Sound in this room behaved differently than it should have as well. Footsteps, her own and those of others, did not echo, as if they were instantly absorbed by the walls, and the first few hours, according to her subjective perception, though objectively, they could have been minutes or even days, passed in almost complete silence, which she described as thick, like cotton in her ears, only without the pressure. Madison described the corridors through which she was led, not by physical force, but as if guided by a current of air. Figures in loose, light-colored coveralls, their faces hidden by matte masks with no distinct features, taller than the average person, but not caricaturally tall. She emphasized to the psychologist that she could not recall any voices or attempts at speech on their part, only images and sensations that she herself interpreted as questions or instructions, as if the information were being transmitted directly into her consciousness, bypassing her hearing. According to her, the rooms where she spent most of her time consisted of a series of compartments with walls made of a translucent material, behind which she could make out the silhouettes of other people who appeared to be in a state similar to deep sleep. In one of the compartments, she claimed to have recognized a face, that of a young woman from a missing person poster she had seen years earlier in a news report, Brittany Sorrell, who went missing in Nevada in 2009 and is still listed in databases as an unsolved case. According to her, she had never experienced hunger during that entire time, which led the endocrinologists who later consulted with her to raise a separate question, specifically noted in her medical record, but left unanswered. The patient, who had been absent for 12 years, was admitted in a state of moderate but not severe emaciation, indicators far more consistent with several weeks of malnutrition than with years. Madison described only rare instances when she was led to a niche in the wall from which, according to her, something like a thick, tasteless liquid would appear, which she drank without feeling hungry beforehand or full afterward. In one of the few coherent passages of the story, she mentioned an older woman with whom, as it seemed to her, had some sort of wordless connection, a woman she called the one with the scar on her chin, and who, Madison felt, had been there much longer than she had. Investigators were unable to identify this woman. No details, other than the scar, matched any case in the publicly accessible NAMUS database or in the databases to which Special Agent Kovacs had access. The procedures, which Madison described only in fragments and reluctantly, boiled down, in her words, to regular extractions. Periods when she was taken to a separate room, laid down on a surface she described as cold but not icy, and subjected to procedures that left precisely those symmetrical marks on her wrist and behind her ear. She wasn't describing pain in the usual sense, but rather a sensation as if something that has no name were being pulled out of her body, accompanied by a brief loss of consciousness. Subjectively, based on her own estimate, the entire period lasted maybe 2 years, maybe 3. I counted the days at first, but then I stopped because the days there were all the same, and there were no windows. She cannot explain how 12 calendar years on the outside fit into the 2 or 3 years of her own perception, and it was precisely this discrepancy, confirmed both by medical examinations and by her own account, that became the central, most disturbing, and least refutable detail of the entire case. The only moment that Madison described with anything resembling clarity rather than fragmentation was an episode that, as she recalled, occurred toward the end of her stay there, when one of the compartment walls, which were normally opaque, became transparent for a few seconds, and she saw beyond it not the neighboring compartment, but something she described as an open space with points of light, too numerous and too still to be the stars she remembered. The wall returned to its original state before she had a chance to make out anything else, and trying to describe what she had seen to the psychologist was the hardest part of all. According to the doctor, at that moment, for the first time during the entire interview, Madison began to cry, repeating that there was the wrong amount of light for the sky. She remembers the end of her time there less clearly than anything else, Another flash of light, that same sensation of thick, suffocating air, and then the asphalt beneath her feet and the headlights of an approaching truck on the empty Highway 90, 40 miles from the house she'd left on her bike 12 years ago. It is important to emphasize, everything stated above is exclusively her own account, recorded from Madison Tate's own words and not corroborated by any independent source, any surveillance camera footage, or any witness other than her own memory, which even her treating psychologist described as fragmented and subject to distortions typical of prolonged trauma. The world's reaction to Madison's return was just as divided as it had been when she first disappeared, only the stakes were higher this time. A segment of the psychiatric community, including a consultant invited by the district attorney's office, proposed a working theory of dissociative fugue, complicated by prolonged psychological trauma and, possibly, confabulation, a condition in which the brain fills in memory gaps with plausible but untrue details, especially after experiencing violence or isolation. In this version, the marks on the body were explained as traces of medical procedures of unknown origin, possibly related to prolonged confinement in conditions that fell far short of sanitary standards. The theory of kidnapping and human trafficking, which, for all its grimness, fit much more easily into the usual investigative framework than anything else. FBI Special Agent Diana Kovacs, who was assigned to the case after it was picked up by the national media, publicly stated that she considers the theory of an organized crime group involved in the prolonged detention of the victims to be the primary working hypothesis. Not all of the experts consulted on the case agreed unreservedly with the diagnosis of dissociative fugue. Dr. Stephen Kowalski, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to conduct an independent evaluation of Madison's condition, noted separately in his report that classic dissociative fugue is not accompanied by measurable physiological abnormalities. Fugue explains the memory gaps, not the bone age, which is 8 years behind her stated age, he wrote in a memo, which was subsequently partially quoted in the local press. Kowalski did not propose an alternative diagnosis, merely stating that the clinical picture did not fully fit into any category known to him. The problem with this version, for all its rationality, is that it does not fully account for all the facts. It does not explain how the skeletal and dental structure of a body that has physically aged through 12 calendar years corresponds to an age that is 8 or 9 years younger than the one listed on the ID. It does not explain the mineral inclusions in the scar tissue, which the laboratory was unable to classify. She does not explain how Madison, who had never traveled outside Arizona and New Mexico, was able to name Brittany Sorrell from Nevada and describe the circumstances of her disappearance, a case that had never been covered by national news and which, according to her mother and sister, was never discussed within the Tate family. A check conducted after the interview confirmed that Brittany Sorrell has indeed been listed as missing since 2009. The case is on file with the NCIC, to which Madison, of course, never had access. The public reaction to Madison's return across the country differed markedly from the reaction in Branch Creek itself. National tabloids and several major news aggregators picked up the story in the first week, emphasizing the discrepancy between her biological age and her passport age. Headlines about the missing girl who hadn't aged spread across social media faster than the district prosecutor's office could issue its first official statement. In Branch Creek itself, the reaction was more subdued and cautious. Some residents who knew the Tate family personally preferred to leave them alone, while visiting journalists camped out for weeks outside the county hospital, forcing the administration to temporarily restrict access to the emergency room for outsiders. Carol Tate agreed to speak to reporters only once, 3 weeks after her daughter's return, at a brief press conference outside the county courthouse. She read a prepared statement without answering a single question from the audience. "For 12 years, I've been asking the system, which was supposed to be searching for my daughter, to act more quickly. Now I'm asking that same system to explain to me what happened, and I'm getting the same response I've been getting all these years. The investigation is ongoing. I don't expect anyone to believe what Madison is saying. I expect someone to finally take the trouble to disprove it instead of just closing the file." After that, the family made no further public statements. Skeptics pointed out that such a coincidence could be explained in dozens of ways without resorting to far-fetched theories, ranging from a casual mention in a conversation that no one remembered to a simple coincidence of a name with one of the thousands of similar cases that occasionally surface in local news. Blogger and independent journalist Greg Paulson, who has been investigating the Tate case for several years on his own website dedicated to unsolved disappearances, noted in one of his recent posts, I don't believe in aliens or in perfect explanations. I believe that someone, somewhere, didn't want this case to be closed properly for far too long, and that some of the answers disappeared along with the tissue sample that was taken and never returned. Polson claimed that he had submitted official requests through a federal agency to obtain the results of a laboratory analysis of the sample and had been denied 3 times on the grounds of an ongoing investigation. The agency he had contacted subsequently declined to comment officially on the substance of the request. Polson also pointed out that the $25,000 reward, which the family had announced back in 2012 and which no one had ever claimed, was officially removed from public view only after Madison's return, a routine administrative procedure that nevertheless meant the case formally remained open for the reward for all 12 years, even though active work on it had ceased nearly half that time earlier. For Polson, this was yet another example of the very systemic breakdown that Patty Jensen had been talking about from the very beginning. Not a single conspiracy, but a multitude of minor inconsistencies, bureaucratic delays, and details lost in the process of communication, which, taken together, create a space where something, human or otherwise, can go unnoticed for 12 years in a row. Madison Tate herself declined to make any further public appearances after her only in-depth interview with a psychologist. She spent about 4 months under observation at a specialized clinic, after which, according to her mother, she moved from Sander Creek County to a location the family refuses to disclose to reporters. Carol Tate closed the Project Phoenix page related to her daughter's case a year after Madison's return, posting a brief message to her few followers stating that further details will remain a family matter. The official status of the case in the NCIC was changed from missing to case closed, circumstances unknown, a designation used when a missing person is found alive, but the investigation was unable to determine exactly what happened to them. Haley Tate, who was 24 years old by the time her sister returned, recalled the first few weeks after their reunion as an attempt to get to know anew a person who looked like her sister but remembered the world as it was 12 years ago. Madison, she said, was unfamiliar with half the technologies that had become commonplace during that time, was confused by the city's changed retail landscape, and at the same time avoided any questions about what had happened to her personally. The only topic she brought up of her own accord was the bicycle, the very same blue one found in the ditch, which the police had returned to the family along with the rest of the physical evidence in 2025. According to Haley, Madison asked to keep it in the garage, but never touched it again after that. The section of County Road 181 where a bicycle was once found looks exactly the same today as it did in 2012. The same mosquito bushes, the same gentle curve of the road between 2 low hills. The circle of flattened grass documented in the report from the first day of the search has long since been overgrown and is indistinguishable from the rest of the field. None of the subsequent investigations, including a ground-penetrating radar scan conducted in 2025 at the initiative of an independent research group, revealed anything beneath that area that would distinguish it from the surrounding soil. The only thing left from that evening is a brief entry in the Sander Creek County archives and a spot at the entrance to town where a billboard featuring Madison's face once stood, and where an advertisement for a car wash now hangs. In his latest post on the case, Greg Paulson mentioned another detail that cannot be independently confirmed or refuted, but which, he said, led him to close the book on the matter once and for all. He claimed that in the spring of 2025, while working with Open Access to NamUs as part of a journalistic inquiry, he discovered the case of Brittany Sorrell from Nevada, the very one Madison had mentioned in her story, marked with the status, restricted access, case transferred to federal jurisdiction, without any further explanation, even though just 3 months earlier the record had been opened to public viewing, as is standard for cases registered through NamUs. When he submitted an official request asking for clarification on the reason for the status change, he received no response. Patty Jensen, who shut down Project Phoenix along with her family but continues to work with dozens of other families across the state, summed up the outcome of this case more succinctly and perhaps more accurately than any of the experts involved. We spent 12 years arguing about where one specific girl had gone, and spent almost no time on the question of why the system, which was supposed to be looking for her, allowed a person to disappear so completely without a trace for such a long time. Whatever actually happened to Madison, this part of the story isn't about aliens, it's about us. These words neither negate nor explain the scar tissue, the bone age, or the connection to the Brittany Sorrell case. They merely serve as a reminder that even the most inexplicable story begins with a far more prosaic and far more correctable fact. Somewhere between two databases, two agencies, and 12 years of bureaucratic correspondence, a person can simply cease to exist for a system that is supposed to remember him. What happened to Madison Tate over the course of 12 years is a question that officially remains unanswered, and will likely remain so forever. One could accept the theory of prolonged detention under conditions of criminal isolation, which explains most of the facts, while attributing the physiological inconsistencies and the coincidence with the Sorrell case to statistical chance and the limitations of traumatized memory. One could accept the version presented by Madison herself, a version that cannot be confirmed by documentary evidence nor completely dismissed, because some of the physical evidence, scar tissue, bone age, and a connection to a case she physically could not have known about, has remained without an official explanation, not because no explanation exists, but because someone, apparently, decided that this explanation should not be made publicly available. It's up to you to decide which of these is closer to the truth.